There's been no shortage of great indie retro-styled games over the past few years, so the Angry Video Game Nerd Adventures is something that flew under my radar and into the category of a flash sale game. You know, one that you'd buy out of some unspoken obligation because it was cheap rather than having any real desire to play it. 382 deaths later, I stand by the statement I made to some friends, that the game was an exercise in human misery. The game is advertised as a rewarding, hard but fair 2D platformer in the vein of Castlevania and Mega Man. It's a pseudo-throwback to the NES era with retro sights and sounds, responsive controls, and filled to the brim with the nerd's signature humor. I disagree with a lot of that, so let's start with some positives here. The control really is pretty tight and accurate, with a simple setup of jump, shoot, power up, and a button that lets you switch between James himself and a number of his unlockable nerd pals. The aesthetic is good enough too. It's essentially what you'd expect from a 2D pixel art game, nothing more, nothing less. There's a good variety of environments, with each stage having its own distinct look and enemy variations, along with some interesting gimmicks to go along with it. The game runs pretty smoothly too, I mean, it kind of better. And if I'm gonna praise one thing about this game without question, it's definitely the music. It was easily the highlight of the entire experience for me, to the point where I bought it after playing through this game. The problem with this game, to me, is that the entire thing is based on a joke. A joke that I get, but I don't find funny, or rather, one that I don't find fun to play through. The game is a non-stop barrage of references to old video games, with some being blindingly obvious and some not. It also references the AVGN reviews themselves and general pop culture humor. On a mechanical level, the references are there in the form of brutal spikes in difficulty, sudden, unpredictable deaths, and some pretty recognizable platforming patterns from games of the 8-bit era. I opted to play on the normal difficulty for my playthrough. The fact that they give the player this many lives shows that death was intended to come quickly and often. That clashes a little with the hard but fair label that some have branded this game with, considering how many of the deaths simply came from not knowing what was ahead. For as difficult as the levels can seem, they're actually littered with checkpoints, so death doesn't carry much consequence. With 30 lives per continue on normal alone, you're almost guaranteed to just get through any stage through trial and error. The stages, like the game itself, are all pretty short, and are only extended through the numerous deaths along the way. I guess that's a reference to old bad games too. I get it. The bosses were disappointing, both in how quickly the fights can end for either you or them, and in how simplistic their patterns were. Their phase changes seemed to be mostly limited to how quickly they move too. They were probably the easiest parts of the levels, with one glaring exception, but oh, I'll get to that. Undoubtedly, people will claim that the game isn't about being fun or good, and that it's all about the nerd experience. Putting yourself in the shoes of the angry video game nerd and seeing his humor and anger come to life firsthand. Well, there's one small problem with that. The humor of the angry video game nerd is represented on an extremely base level here, simply banking on swearing and bathroom-related words to convey the character. While the show itself isn't the most sophisticated around, and there's numerous juvenile or just excessive bits, there's a few reasons why I think it tends to click with some people. While the nerd is a fictional character, there are numerous pieces of his creator injected within to make him a bit more believable. This makes the childish, often bizarre expletives work comedically, well, sometimes, because of the juxtaposition of him being passionate, or nerdy if you will, about his interests. There's that blur between the character of the nerd and James Rolfe as a real person, which makes the low-budget and even lower-brow humor kinda work. People like the nerd's anger because it's an amusing contrast to his love of games, cinema, and nostalgia from his own youth, and it's one that can be shared with the audience. He's also pretty well known for a variety of over-the-top body language and facial expressions, none of which are present in this game, by the way. What we're left with is a nerd drained of all humanity, both in the lack of any emotion aside from robotic anger, and from the fact that there's very little in the way of character animation. I understand that you can only do so much with an 8-bit graphical style, but if we're being real here, this is already well beyond what an NES was capable of. The randomly generated rants that happen upon each death try to capture the nerd's often nonsensical choice of gross-out or curse-based dialogue, but it just comes across like a cheap knockoff you'd find in a back alley somewhere. Am I seriously criticizing this game based on its lack of proper characterization though? A retro-style 2D game about the angry video game nerd? Yes, actually I am. Because if you base an entire game around a popular, recognizable character, it's relevant if the character is lacking the charm of what really made them popular and recognizable in the first place. Anyway. While the game is mechanically sound and ironically pretty free of glitches, there are a few missed opportunities with the gameplay. Some kind of collectible would have helped give the game a bit more of a fun, retro feel. Coins, bananas, rings, gems, all sorts of platformers had these. I'm sure they could have found some AVGN equivalent to put in this game. For that matter, why doesn't this game have a point system? That could have added some replay value for those who enjoy it. Points and coins don't really change a game mechanically by themselves, no, but having them could have helped shape the levels in a bit more of an enjoyable way. Also, placebo is a powerful thing. It feels good to collect coins, especially with a nice sound effect to go along with it, and a high score can help paint out your achievements and skill in a tangible way. These additions would have felt much more at home for a retro-style game than Sheaves. The Nerd's NES Zapper Gun is technically not your only weapon, as each member of the Nerd Bunch does offer a different attack or utility. You can also find a Super Scope which disappears after being hit once and doesn't show up all that often to begin with. Aside from the oh-so-funny useless rock, the glitch gremlin, and this thing, your arsenal is still very limited. Even games from the late 1980s often had a pretty wide array of weapons and power-ups to find along the way. More weapons probably could have been useful for more references, too. I don't know, you could use Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde cartridges as grenades, or the pocket protector pens could have been used like a throwing dagger. Something? The death blocks are probably the biggest detractor from making the game enjoyable, and they're spread all throughout the levels very generously. It felt like a crutch to try and increase the difficulty where designing the levels themselves to be challenging just wasn't on the table. I hate these blocks and what they represent more than I hate my own life. I'm getting off track though. The difficulty ramps up considerably for the final stage, and it was here where I begin to lose a large bulk of my lives. It's a culmination of every frustrating part of the game to that point. The numerous insta-kill blocks play off of the Mega Man-esque alternating platforms, the blocks that fall when you step on them, and the invisible segments in an incredibly frustrating way. Once you get through all of that, you get to fight the mastermind behind the whole thing, Fred Crude slang for sexual intercourse. This part alone is where I lost the most lives and asked myself, why should I bother finishing this? This boss is the most difficult by a long shot, and unlike the rest of them, Fred actually does have noticeably different phases depending on how much damage he's taken. Where the real frustration comes in, though, is the stage where you fight him. Using a limited field of vision for the blocks, the floor isn't solid all the way through, with numerous spaces to fall in between and die instantly. Probably an homage to Castlevania Rondo of Blood, because references are funny, right? Having to hit Fred, whose window for damaging him shrinks considerably after he starts his second phase, while keeping from falling, makes this fight infuriating. If you lose all of your lives, and trust me in saying I did numerous times at this point, you have to get through the LJN stage again too, so be prepared for that. If you've made it to Fred at all, you've probably memorized the stage at that point anyway though. While it is certainly possible to beat him, most notably if you switch to Guitar Guy for his ball phases, the fight with Fred and his stage just left me feeling miserable rather than fulfilled. Not so much just playing it, but thinking about how invoking that feeling of frustration was the entire point of the game, and how it had worked on me. That was the joke. I got it. 382 deaths later, I wasn't really laughing so much as rolling my eyes. I wasn't satisfied upon beating this game, so much as relieved that it was finally over. I can't say that the designers did a poor job, because they fully accomplished what they set out to do.
The game was meant to be a short, cheap, and anger-inducing reference to games of the past, and they certainly captured that feeling for better or for worse. AVGN Adventures could even be classified as a simulator, as you put yourself in the perspective of someone making a review for a game that they're clearly not having fun with. It feels like work because that's what it is. When I was playing the game for this video, I just wanted to stop, mostly when fighting Fred. It gave me a whole new level of respect for those who do this sort of thing for a living. Maybe I can admire the game for being successful at invoking those feelings of frustration, impatience, and eventual release. There are games with much bigger budgets that have evoked little to no feelings from me, so while I have been railing on the game for some time, at least it left an impression. While your mileage may vary depending on your tolerance for frustration, what aspects of the AVGN you personally value, and whether you have the game already or not, I find myself hard-pressed to recommend this game. While it does most everything it sets out to do, mechanically anyway, it's not going to appeal to most people as more than a novelty. While this game was clearly made by fans, with the express purpose of it being for fans, I found it insufferable. Some have said that this game should have been free if it was going to intentionally be a bad and frustrating experience, but I disagree with that. There was genuine effort put into it, especially with the music, which I'm going to recommend now on its own. But that doesn't salvage the rest of the game, unfortunately. I'm maybe not the biggest nerd fan, nor do I laugh at or find all of his videos entertaining, but I'm still a fan, just not of his adventures.